Guys Tribe, and welcome to Anju Asks. This session is all about getting a divorce in Singapore, and I'm here with Hoon Shu Mei from Drew Napier. She's an accredited mediator and a collaborative family practitioner, which basically means a really accomplished family lawyer. And she works here in Singapore with Drew and Napier, and is here to tell us all about an introduction to getting a divorce in Singapore. Thank you so much for being with us today, Shu Mei. I know you're an SSEW member as well, so it's great to have you in the group, and it's great for you to be able to speak to our audience and understand some of the issues that do come up from time to time in the group. It's a really important topic for us ladies to be aware of. So I'm going to talk to you about the laws that apply to us as expats, what might happen to our assets, and what also, most importantly, if we are parents, what will happen to our children. So let's get started. As an expat, and I'm just going to preface this by saying I have no idea about the answers that are going to come up in this conversation. It's just as much, an information session for me. I'm just out there like everybody else. Am I eligible for a divorce in Singapore as an expat?
Okay, so assuming you're not a citizen or permanent resident, you have to live here for at least 3 years.
Okay.
And be married for at least 3 years.
Okay.
So that rule applies to everyone, really. You have to be married for at least 3 years, and the purpose of that is really for parties to give a shot at your marriage. Just acknowledging that the first few years are hard.
Yes.
And then if you are not from Singapore, that you have been resident in Singapore for at least 3 years prior to filing for a divorce.
Right. So if you have been married for 3 years, what happens then once you've decided, okay, I've had enough, it's time to put this to an end? What's the process? Just briefly, can you outline it for me?
Okay, so essentially divorce in Singapore, there's two big steps.
Okay.
The first step is for the court to dissolve the marriage.
Okay.
And then once that is done, the court looks at what's called the ancillary matters.
Okay.
And you've picked up on some of that. That relates to custody of the children, maintenance relating to the wife and children, and then lastly, the division of assets. Okay, so in those two big steps, And in relation to the divorce, I suppose what one looks at is really, the only question really is, has this marriage broken down irretrievably? And to prove that, we need to show either adultery or unreasonable behavior or desertion. So those are the fault-based facts. Or there has to be separation for at least 3 years.
Right.
And both sides, if both sides agree there should be a divorce, then it just needs to be filed. Or if you don't have the consent of your spouse, then you need to be separated for 4 years. So that's quite a long period for some people. So what we often see is either parties relying on unreasonable behavior or separation. If they can wait, separation, because I suppose it's the most kind of neutral ground.
For 3 or 4 years. Yeah, that's quite a long time
to
wait.
It is.
But I guess it's just a question of the paperwork,
that's
right?
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes what people do is they have the arrangements in place.
Yes.
They might even have an agreement.
Yes.
Setting out everything.
Yes.
And then it's just a matter of waiting for the time, and then they file.
And then you file for the paperwork. Okay, so
that's right.
Leading on from that, let's talk a little bit about assets. As an expat, it can be a little bit confusing, complicated, tricky, because you might have properties in different countries. You might have joint accounts. Your finances might be a bit different over here if there's one breadwinner who's earning a salary, who's taking care of savings more than the other partner, for example. You might have properties in joint names in different countries. How does that all work?
Okay, so essentially the law is, there's 2 steps to assets. First is, what are the matrimonial assets? So the definition of matrimonial assets are basically assets earned or acquired during the course of marriage. So It doesn't actually matter if it's sole name, joint name, property in Singapore, Bali, UK, it doesn't matter.
Right.
As long as it was earned or acquired during the marriage by either party or both parties.
Right.
Okay, so that's the first determiner. And then there are also other exceptions to that rule. Premarital assets and gifts and inheritance, those things are usually out. but there are some qualifiers to that. So for example, if there is a premarital asset, let's just say an apartment in France. Okay, but only by you prior to marriage, but then post-marriage it was used as a holiday home, then it becomes a matrimonial asset.
Why?
Well, it's
How unfair.
I know. Right. So the idea is that if it was used for the family for various reasons, such as social, educational, recreational, etc., I won't go into all of it.
Yes.
It can become a matrimonial asset.
Wow.
It gets converted into a matrimonial asset. Gifts from third parties and inheritances are generally excluded unless you can show that the other spouse, the non-recipient spouse,
Yes.
has substantially improved it,
Okay.
or there was intention to share it.
Okay, so
Yeah.
if it was a sum of money and they've invested it and grown that sum of money,
Right.
for example, they've improved it, or if
Yes.
it's a property and it's been extended and maintained and renovated, etc., and
Exactly.
it's been improved on.
Yeah, so it has to be substantial and something quantifiable. Then it can also become a matrimonial asset. So
I
usually
see.
in cases of third-party gifts, inheritances, I would advise clients to keep it separate completely, and ensure that it is kept separate from the other spouse and joint savings money, so it's not intermingled.
Very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
That's something to bear in mind for sure. So going on from that, still talking about money and assets, how do you work out whether once you have separated,
Yeah.
you're going to be looked after? What about maintenance?
Okay, so before going on to maintenance, so I talked about the first question the court looks at what are the matrimonial assets.
Yes.
Then the second step in that process is how are the matrimonial assets divided.
Yes.
So a wife shouldn't worry too much, an ex-wife shouldn't worry too much just because they haven't contributed financially towards those assets, because
Right.
the court looks at both financial contributions and non-financial contributions.
Okay.
So, non-financial contributions could be caring for the family,
Yes.
the household,
Yes.
supervising the renovators and contractors,
That is all work.
turning
Absolutely.
up for networking galas. Yeah. So the woman behind the men essentially, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What I will say though in Singapore is that there is no presumption of equality when it comes to division of assets. It depends on a whole host of factors like those I just mentioned, duration
Right.
of marriage, etc.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not assumed that everything will be split 50-50
Correct.
once
Because
you've outlined what your assets are.
Exactly.
So how do they decide how it's
So
assigned?
there is no calculator. It depends on the court's discretion based on those sorts of factors like duration of marriage, both sides' contributions, whether they're children to the marriage, etc.
Right.
So in general, for long marriages, so we're looking at marriages in that 20 plus years
Okay.
and above region, there is an inclination towards equality. The idea is that, well, we've been together for a very long time,
Yeah.
so the court will say, well, these guys wanted to be together and had the intention to be together for life, so it would be fair to divide close to equality if
Yes.
it's equal.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that might not be the case for
For most
a
marriages,
shorter marriage. Yes.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. You would just have to look at your financial contributions as well as the non-financial contributions. Everything matters. Yeah.
And if somebody wanted to get advice on what that outcome is likely to be,
That's possible.
that's something
yeah.
that you would be able to advise on if
Absolutely.
somebody would approach you with their
Yes.
situation, just to get an idea of how the
Yes.
courts would look at it, so that you
Yes.
got an idea of your position, because that's quite a big deal.
It is quite a big deal, and I suppose, and I know one of your questions later on will be how would one prepare for divorce. So
Yeah.
one way I would help a client prepare is help them consider their rights in Singapore,
Yes.
as well as consider whether there could be a different country that they would get a divorce at
Yes, where it might be
where
more
they would be
favourable.
better off,
Mm.
potentially looking at each segment in
Mm.
totality, considering cost, procedure, how long everything takes,
Mm.
because all of that would have an impact on mental health as well.
Oh,
as financial
100%.
costs. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this process can take a long time,
Exactly.
right? So that's really good advice to consider the other places that might be more favourable
Absolutely.
to your situation.
Yeah. So you also asked about maintenance, right?
Yeah, so
Okay.
how does that work?
Okay, so if you're married as a current wife and you are cut off, you are entitled to maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
A former wife obviously post-divorce would also be entitled to maintenance under Singapore law. The considerations would be everything from income, earning capacity. I say earning capacity because if one party has lost their job, doesn't mean that they don't need to pay maintenance. Right? And similarly, if a wife has lost her job, it doesn't mean she then can say, well, I have no job now, you should pay me what I used to earn, because the court would consider, well, can you work? Have you attempted to find a job? To replace your job, etc. And obviously, you know, there are other considerations such as immigration policies, etc. as well, that prevent some expert women from working if they're on a dependence pass.
Yes.
So they look at really a totality of factors, including obviously what are the needs of the wife, what are the needs of the children. Yeah.
So is it?
There is no kind of maintenance calculator. So some jurisdictions have a maintenance calculator, not in Singapore.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was going to be my next question. How can you try and work out how much you would receive and whether it would be enough to really, you know, is it fair? Do they factor in everything that, you know, what you think you need to maintain your lifestyle might not be how the court thinks about it?
Absolutely. So what the court would do is consider all of these factors I mentioned, but also what the parties' needs are, and acknowledging the fact that when parties are together, there is one set of expenses, but that post-divorce, there are usually two sets of expenses, and acknowledging that new reality.
Right.
And so there's even case law just from a few years ago which suggests that the husband's not meant to be an insurance policy for the wife. If the wife is able to obtain a job, obtain some means for herself as an income, that should be encouraged. Yeah. So I suppose there is that kind of new reality that the Singapore courts are looking at as well, that as it becomes more liberal, it would consider those sorts of factors as well.
Right.
So, yeah.
So not just to rely on the
just because you have been maintained at a certain level just shouldn't mean that you should be maintained at that level forever and ever more.
Yes.
So all sorts of orders could be made. It could be a lump sum order. It could be an order for periodic payment. That, for example, it should be in every quarter. It may not be a monthly sum.
Right.
It could even be that a maintenance order would only last for 5 years,
Right.
and during that period, the wife's postgraduate degree might be paid for, so that she gets on her feet,
Right.
and then is able to work after. So there are myriad of orders available.
Yes.
And really it does depend on the circumstance of the case, the facts involved, and then I would probably advise
Yes.
what would work best.
Yes, and that
Yeah.
has to be agreed on in the courts.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. Maintenance. Yeah, there's a lot of ifs and buts, right?
There's a lot
It's
of
really.
ifs and buts.
I mean, there are so many different situations that people are in, so
Absolutely.
the court has to cater for everybody.
Yeah.
Similarly with children.
Yes.
So as expats, again, you know, you might have parents of different nationalities. You may have been here only for a short amount of time. What happens about so many questions? Firstly, custody. Does the mother, you know, automatically get custody?
Okay.
Is it assumed that, you know, Singapore holds its kind of family values very strongly?
Yes.
Do they favour the mother in this
Okay.
case?
So let's talk about custody and what the meaning of custody is. Okay. So custody is actually a bundle of rights. We can another term for it is parental responsibility. Okay. Essentially, it means the parental responsibility to make major decisions relating to education, religion, or major medical decisions. It doesn't mean like the day-to-day, oh, my child had a cut, should I see a doctor about it? We're talking about fairly major decisions. Educational, again, fairly major educational decisions, such as changing schools, picking up a new second language, that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah.
So in Singapore, custody orders are usually joint.
Right.
Okay, joint between both parents. It is unusual to get a sole custody order unless one parent is extremely neglectful or abusive.
Right.
And honestly, in the history of me working on matters, unless there's an agreement for one party to have sole custody, it's not really been done, because the courts are quite insistent that we should order joint custody so that parents are encouraged to work together to communicate. Okay. Now, I think broadly, when people use the word custody in movies or you hear it on TV, what they really mean is care and control in Singapore. In another country, that could be called the residence order.
Right.
So
yes.
that basically is the parent who has day-to-day care of the child, supports the child in making decisions on a day-to-day basis. It would be like the parent who says, okay, today this is what your day looks like, who you shall play with, what instruments you might take up, who are your tutors. So really, most of the decisions would lie with that parent or in reality.
Yes.
Okay? And the parent who then doesn't have care and control then has access rights. So that could be anything from a few hours a week to half the time. Right? We see all sorts of orders, and it just really does depend on who that parent is. There is kind of no assumption that because it really does depend on how hands-on that parent is.
Right. So it's not assumed that the care and control would be assigned to the mother.
Okay. So I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Okay. So for very young children, there is a bias. Okay. So there is a case that says that if all things are equal for very young children, the maternal bond is recognized.
Okay.
So what that means is if everything was on par, they would generally try and provide a grant care and control to the mother.
Okay.
If there was a dispute.
Okay. How do you define very young children? What age are we talking up to?
We're looking really at 5 and below.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, we're really looking kind of that infancy, toddlerhood, preschooling age.
Yes.
Yeah.
When they're a handful.
Yeah, exactly. So there is an acknowledgement of a bond. So it'll be interesting to see whether that changes in the future.
Yes.
But at the moment, I would say it's generally quite difficult for fathers to get care and control, all things being equal. Obviously, we've also managed to support dads in that way when they have been shown to be really good.
Yes.
And go above and beyond,
Yes.
Yeah.
Caring
in that way.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for distinguishing and defining what custody actually means.
Yes.
I think that is really important and is very different to the care and control. I think they are very confused actually. So I'm really glad that you pointed out, because I was also thinking about it differently.
Yeah.
Really important. So what if you want to divorce, but you don't want to stay in Singapore and you have children? Presumably it's not a problem if you don't have children. Once you've divorced, you're free to go where you choose. Is that correct?
Not really.
Oh gosh, wow. Okay, nothing simple here.
Nothing simple. Okay. So let's just go back to the original question, right?
Yep.
Assuming the relationship has broken down, whether parties are married or not, but they have children.
Yes.
Okay, and one side, let's just say the mother in this case, decides that actually remaining in Singapore is not good for various reasons, including the fact that maybe you can't get a job on a DP or LTVP.
Yes.
And you're unhappy here and you think, well, I just want to move back to England with my kids. Can I do it? Right? That's essentially the question.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would first look at whether there is a basis for relocating. Okay. So to relocate to a different country, you would need either the express agreement of your spouse, ex-spouse, ex-partner, parents of the children, essentially. And if there is no express agreement, then I would look at, would this be a situation where we would apply to court? So you would apply to court formally for what's called international relocation.
Okay.
So what you would do is you would provide your best case why a relocation would be in the best interest of the children. It's not why it would be in my best interest as mom to leave, but in the best interest of the children. And I will look at a variety of factors, including potentially family support overseas, reduced educational expenses. Those are the kind of common reasons. And because of COVID, I guess a lot of people haven't seen a family in now what could be 2 years, right? So maintaining connection with family members. We had a case involving a child with special needs, and looking at Singapore and Australia, the situation was that in Australia the child would just be better supported there for much less cost. So these are some of the considerations. Okay.
Right.
And obviously, the opposing parent would then say, no, the child should remain in Singapore. Now, then what happens, and I think this is the bigger question, and I see a lot of it on the SSEW group, is that a lot of people say, well, can I just take my child and leave the country without agreement? Okay, and I think this goes to the Hague Convention on International Child Abduction. So this is basically a 1980 convention, okay, and there are over 110 countries that have ratified it. The idea is that the convention's there to protect the interest of the child. So that if a child is removed from their habitual residence, so if Singapore's their habitual residence, they've lived here now for a few years, this is where they go to school, this is where their friends are, this is where they've been cared for, and they are removed without the consent of the other parent to another country. The first question I would ask is the other country one of the countries parties to the Hague Convention and recognizes Singapore's ratification? If it is, then the parent, so the parent who didn't abduct the child is called in legal terms, we call that parent left behind parent.
Right.
So the left behind parent would often go to the other country and make an application under the Hague Convention, assuming they are a contracting party, for the child to be returned to Singapore. So this process is actually a summary process. It's only countries that agree to the convention try and complete it during a period of 6 weeks.
Okay.
So the court in the other country, unless there are certain defenses which are extremely limited in nature are met, will return the child back to its habitual residence. It is not the court that decides whether the child should be in the care or custody of their parent, because it is not the court's place. The only decision it needs to make is, where is the habitual residence of the child? Is it Singapore or England, in the example I gave you?
Yes.
And if so, if Singapore, do any of the defenses apply? If no defenses apply, then the child must be returned to Singapore. So I would always ask a client or a potential client to please consider the various issues that exist before doing something rash, because there are plenty of psychological studies out there that also show that if a child is abducted and a court later says your child must be returned back to the habitual residence, that process of returning the child, and then that parent then makes an application to formally remove the child, and if that child succeeds, that kind of back and forth is actually psychologically destabilizing for the child.
Yes.
So it's much better to say, okay, what are the options, and can we reach an agreement on this issue?
Yes, because you've got the mental breach of the relationship splitting, and then you also have the physical breach.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yes, I can see that would be quite traumatic for the child.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's in their interest to try and keep things amicable and simple.
Absolutely. And at the same time, I also see that this is one of the very, very, very hard decisions to make.
Yeah, of course.
It can seem very black and white.
Yes.
Because one parent might need to work here, and another parent, because the relationship is over, doesn't have much connection to the country other than the child, wants to leave. Yes. So it is an incredibly difficult and challenging decision to make.
Yes. Very interesting. I think that's given us a good kind of broad understanding of the kind of main topics that we would need to consider. Just as a final takeaway, what are the key points that you would advise anybody who's kind of maybe is considering a divorce or thinking about it, just to try and make the process simple, if it's possible? Just to try and arm yourself a little bit. How would you prepare?
You know, one of the things when I got this question on email, one thing I wrote was mental health. Right. Because the typical lawyer's answer will be like, okay, you need to prepare your receipts, get evidence of the unreasonable behavior or the adultery. Right. All of those things are important, but nothing is as important as your mental health. Yeah. Because a divorce proceeding, especially if contested, is actually considered one of the most stressful things. Right. So I would first look at how can I ensure that I'm in the best mental health possible, given that I'm about to enter what could be a potentially stressful time of my life. Absolutely. And then I would meet with someone like myself to go through, well, okay, now that I'm here, what do I need to do before filing for divorce?
Yes.
Including, other than collecting evidence, etc., including exploring whether mediation is something that could work.
Yes.
Or a collaborative process to try and see, can we sort this out amicably?
That is really good advice, because I think, as you say, it's something that, obviously it's a huge thing. You don't enter into it lightly.
Absolutely.
But we often are, thinking about the process and the bigger picture and forgetting ourselves.
Yeah.
So that is really, really good advice that will take you through the whole process as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Shu Mei. It has been really, really insightful. And Shu Mei is also going to be putting together a list of resources for anybody who's looking for more information, and other groups and ports of call to help with this whole process. There are so many things to think about. So I'm going to put that up in the comments later on. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found it useful. Thank you again so much, Shu Mei. It's been really, really valuable. It's been great having you today.
Well, thank you, Anju, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone.